Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another video lecture for Psych 370. In my last video lecture, I talked about some of the problematic side effects that can result from the use of punishment, like fear, aggression, the potential for abuse. And those problems have led psychologists to develop a number of alternatives to punishment. And so in this video lecture, I want to go over a few of those alternatives with you. And so in this video, I'll be talking about a few of the other ways, besides punishment, that you might try to eliminate or at least modify an unwanted behavior. Guys, the first alternative to punishment that the textbook describes is what it refers to as response prevention, which is where you actually alter the person's or the animal's environment in such a way as to eliminate even the possibility of the behavior occurring. So you just prevent the response prevention. For example, both of my parents worked when I was growing up. So once we were old enough to be left on our own, my brother and I would usually have the house to ourselves for a little while after school. And like most kids, I suppose, we'd sometimes do stuff that we weren't really supposed to do during that time. And probably one of the tamer examples that I could share with you would be that we liked to get into the box of fruit roll ups that was supposed to be reserved for our lunches. So my mom would buy a box of those things, expecting it to last a while. She'd then find it empty a day or two later. She didn't appreciate that, of course. So she started hiding the box from us. So she prevented us from performing that behavior of eating all the fruit roll ups. And a similar example of response prevention, which I've employed with my dog, is that to keep my dog from getting into the trash can and leaving garbage all over the house, I simply lock the trash can so that she can't perform that behavior. So, in both of these cases, we're talking about the environment being altered in some way in order to prevent a behavior from occurring. That's how response prevention works. And if you try, I'm sure you can think of your own examples of response prevention that you or people you know have experienced. It's a pretty common strategy for dealing with unwanted behavior. But of course, the person or the animal doesn't really learn anything with response prevention. I mean, my dog hasn't learned not to get into the trash. She just physically can't do that anymore. And another limitation of response prevention is that it isn't always possible to change the environment like that. So, stopping a problematic behavior isn't always going to be as simple as just preventing it from occurring. For example, if you've got a kid who's throwing temper tantrums, and you want to eliminate or reduce the frequency of those temper tantrums, then it's not really clear how a technique like response prevention would help you do that. It's not really clear how you could alter that child's environment in order to prevent them from being able to throw temper tantrums anymore. So, response prevention can be a useful alternative to punishment, but it's not really feasible in every case. So, another option is what we talked about last week: extinction, non reinforcement. So instead of actively punishing the behavior that we want to weaken, we could just make sure that it doesn't get reinforced. And as you saw when we covered extinction, that should eventually reduce the frequency of that behavior. So if there's a behavior that used to produce reinforcers for you, and now it doesn't, then you're probably going to stop doing that thing, right? So extinction is a pretty obvious alternative to punishment, but it has its problems too. It's not a perfect method either. For one thing, it's like response prevention in that it can also be hard to implement. So, when you try to extinguish a behavior, you're trying to make it so that no reinforcer follows it, right? But it's not always easy to identify and remove all of the reinforcers that might be maintaining that behavior. So, there's the practical matter of actually putting a true extinction schedule in place for the behavior that you'd like to extinguish. And then for another thing, I also talked last week about some of the side effects of extinction, right? So, like punishment, extinction can also result in some problematic changes in behavior. For example, I talked about extinction burst, where a behavior may actually become more frequent for a while when you first stop reinforcing it. And like punishment, extinction is also associated with emotional behaviors like aggression and fits of anger, frustration. Now, we do often prefer extinction to punishment. We do generally consider the side effects of extinction to be less harmful than those of punishment. But having said that, extinction is not without its own problems. So, next, let's talk about another alternative to punishment that involves not just putting the unwanted behavior on extinction, but also reinforcing another specific behavior instead. Now, your textbook refers to this technique as differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, or DRA, but it's also known as differential reinforcement of other behavior, DRO. Whatever you want to call it, it's a pretty straightforward idea. You just combine the extinction of one behavior with the reinforcement of some other more appropriate alternative. So, guys, in one of my previous video lectures for this week, I mentioned that punishers tend to be more effective when the person or animal has some other way to get whatever reinforcer they were after in the first place. And this technique employs a similar kind of logic, but with it, there's no punisher. Again, this is an alternative to punishment. So, with DRA or DRO, you're just extinguishing one behavior and reinforcing something else. For example, let's say that a teacher is having a problem with her students where they keep interrupting her by blurting things out in the middle of class. And let's say that in the past, she has reinforced those comments by responding to them, by giving those students her attention. So, to deal with this problem, she might start ignoring her students when they interject like that. So, she might try to extinguish that behavior. And at the same time, she might reinforce her students for raising their hands and waiting to be called on before they comment. So she could implement a DRA strategy like that. Now, would a simple extinction strategy reduce the frequency of those unsolicited comments by her students? Well, yeah, it probably would eventually. But combining that strategy with the reinforcement of this alternative hand raising behavior is likely to solve the problem more quickly. Because this way, the students are not being deprived of the reinforcer, right? They can still get it. They just have to perform a different behavior for it. So, if it's the teacher's attention that those students are really after, then providing them with this other option as far as how to get it should result in a more rapid decrease in the behavior that the teacher wants to get rid of. So, that's how DRA works, or DRO. And a related technique is called differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, or DRI. And it's basically the same as that DRA strategy that I just talked about, except that with this one, the behavior that you're reinforcing is actually incompatible with the one that you've placed on extinction. So, in other words, with DRI, performing the reinforced behavior makes it impossible for the person or the animal to also perform the behavior that you're trying to extinguish. So if the behavior that you're reinforcing and the behavior that you're extinguishing, if they can't both occur at the same time, then you'd say those behaviors are incompatible with each other. And a psychologist would say that you're using this differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior technique. For example, one problem that we sometimes see in autistic children is that they'll hit or otherwise harm themselves, right? So they'll perform what we call self injurious behaviors. So let's say that we're designing an intervention to get an autistic boy to stop pulling his hair. Let's say that that's the self injurious behavior that we'd like to eliminate in this boy. Well, for one thing, we need to extinguish the hair pulling behavior, right? We need to ignore that behavior. We might decide to stop it when we see it, but we need to make sure that we aren't reinforcing that behavior with attention or displays of concern or anything like that. And at the same time, we need to reinforce an incompatible behavior. So we might decide that we're going to pay attention to this boy, we're going to interact with him when he sits at his desk with his hands folded like this. So we might pick that as the behavior that we're going to reinforce for this boy, because if his hands are folded together like that, then obviously he can't pull his hair at the same time, right? Those are incompatible behaviors. And again, instead of just extinguishing the hair pulling behavior, instead of just withholding reinforcers for that behavior, our differential reinforcement of this other incompatible behavior is likely to bring about a quicker reduction in the hair pulling. So, guys, DRI is basically just a specific example of that DRA or DRO technique that I just talked about. It's a specific type of that strategy where the other alternative behavior that you're now reinforcing is actually incompatible with the one that you're not reinforcing. It's incompatible with the one that you're trying to extinguish. So, these are similar techniques. And finally, guys, one last alternative to punishment that I want to mention here is called differential reinforcement of low rate, or DRL. And this one's a little different because with DRL, you're not necessarily trying to eliminate a behavior altogether. You're just trying to decrease how often that behavior occurs. So, as the name suggests, differential reinforcement of low rate involves providing a reinforcer for responding at a low rate. With this one, the person or the animal gets the reinforcer when they perform the response infrequently. And guys, in practice, the way this usually works is that the response is only reinforced if a certain amount of time has passed since the previous response. For example, if you're using a DRL 10-second schedule, then that would mean that the person or the animal would have to go at least 10 seconds without making the response. 10 seconds have to pass without the response occurring. And then after those 10 seconds have passed, the next response that the person or animal makes will produce the reinforcer. So that sounds kind of like a fixed interval schedule, right? But the difference is that with DRL, if the animal performs the response before the interval ends, then that will actually restart the interval. So, for example, if only 9 seconds have passed since the person or animal last made the response, then not only will that response not get reinforced, but now 10 more seconds have to pass without a response before the next response can get reinforced. So the clock resets on a DRL schedule. It doesn't do that on a fixed interval schedule or on a variable interval schedule, but it does reset on a DRL schedule. And obviously, the longer that required waiting period is on a DRL schedule, the slower the rate of responding that the person or the animal has to exhibit. On a DRL 10-second schedule, the response rate can't exceed 6 responses per minute, right? On a DRL 30-second schedule, it can't exceed 2 responses per minute. So when you use a DRL schedule, what you'll typically do is you'll start with a fairly short interval. You'll start with a fairly short waiting period, like maybe 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and then you'll gradually lengthen it until you've successfully slowed the behavior down to an acceptable rate. So, for example, let's say that you're a teacher and you've got a student who's been asking you for permission to go to the restroom about 20 times a day, and that's too much. So, you want to reduce the rate at which that behavior occurs. You want to make it more infrequent. Well, what you might decide to do at first is grant this child permission to use the restroom if they go, say, 30 minutes without asking you. So if 30 minutes go by and they didn't ask you to go during that time, then the next time they ask, you'll say it's okay, they can go. However, if they ask you before that time period is up, then the clock restarts. It goes back to zero. So now a fresh 30 minutes have to pass before you're going to be willing to grant their request to use the restroom. So maybe you'll start with a DRL 30-minute schedule like that. But of course, the student could still perform that behavior at a pretty high rate on that schedule, right? They could still ask you twice an hour. So after a while, you might increase the waiting period to 45 minutes. After you've given the kid a chance to acclimate to that schedule, you might increase it to a full hour, and so on until the required waiting period has gotten long enough that this student's rate of asking to go has been decreased to a level that you deem appropriate. So that's how differential reinforcement of low rate schedules work. You require a certain amount of time to pass where the response doesn't occur before the next response will get reinforced. And guys, DRL schedules are effective. They can be used to transform very frequently occurring behaviors into much less frequently occurring ones. So, in an example like this, where we don't necessarily want to eliminate the behavior of asking to go to the restroom, but we do want to make it occur less often, a DRL schedule is a viable option and a reasonable alternative to punishment. Okay, well, that's all I have for you on these alternatives to punishment. Please let me know if you have any questions about this stuff. And please also check out the last video lecture for this week, which is a short one on the theories of punishment that are discussed on pages 243 through 245 of your textbook. That's going to do it for this one, though. So take care.